The world can't get over how dysfunctional D.C. is, but my next guest says America's politicians are actually benefiting from it. Mark Leibovich is the chief national correspondent for the New York Times Magazine, and he spent 5 years delving into the inner workings of Washington, and he came to a deeply disturbing conclusion. It's all in his new book, This Town, and he joins me now from where else? That town, Washington. Mark, welcome. Now, you say the city, which is meant to be the center of public service, is instead teeming with corruption and self-interest, professional incest, greed, and more. I mean, is it awful? Is it really that bad?
Well, I mean, it actually is very, very pleasant when you're here. I mean, this is one of the more comfortable places in the country, and I think what people miss when they see Washington being hopelessly divided and dysfunctional is that, in fact, it's hopelessly interconnected. And this has become the wealthiest metropolitan area in the United States. I mean, Washington, D.C. is home to 7 of the wealthiest 10 counties in the United States, and this is a combination of the boom around money or a boom around politics and media and celebrity in politics, which has benefited everyone except for the people who are allegedly being served.
Well, let me just put up statistics that show exactly what you're saying. The stunning statistic in your book is about lobbyists, in other words, money. In 1974, 3% of retiring members of Congress became lobbyists. Now it's 50% of senators and 42% of congressmen who do so. So it really is just one big revolving door.
In a big way. I mean, I think the founders envisioned a system where people would come to Washington, serve for a time, and then return to their communities, whether their shop or their farm or their medical practice or whatever. And what you've seen in the last few decades, in part because of the large amounts of money in the system, is that it has become this warm bath where people can just make a living and become permanent, political or media figures and brands on their own, and that has become really the engine that drives a lot of the politics that you see on TV, but ultimately doesn't serve the country well.
So let's talk about the current crisis, which obviously is the shutdown. And as we said, something even worse is being raised now, the idea that America will default on its debt. And that, as every expert has said, could really trigger a terrible global economic crisis. So your own newspaper, the New York Times, had an amazing story this weekend about how, in fact, this shutdown is not some spontaneous thing that happened at the last moment, but that had been in the workings for years and months, and that had been, buoyed by the very money that you're talking about. Very rich activists have put a lot of money into toppling the government, shutting it down, and trying to topple Obamacare. I think people overseas just simply wouldn't have expected that. Tell us a little bit about that.
I think actually a lot of people domestically wouldn't have expected that. I mean, I thought it was an incredibly eye-opening story, and I think basically, I mean, like you said, I mean, the illusion of this being a grassroots, spontaneous, emotional outburst against the government, in fact, is this systematically very, very well-funded effort, by some very, very powerful and wealthy interests that is causing a lot of this. And I really think that that was an eye-opener. But I also think the other part of this is if you look at the single most, influential person on Capitol Hill right now, it's Ted Cruz, who has essentially been in office for just a few months. He has the power of media attention, which itself is governing, this celebrity, which will probably result in him running for president in 2016. And that in itself becomes a far greater currency than actually accomplishing things, working together, passing bills, levels of experience that used to be what people valued in politics.
And of course, that flies in the face of what the American people feel about this, because by wide margins, they did not want this government shut down, even if they didn't like Obamacare. But let me ask you about, what's being said in the rest of the world. There are headlines, flying around like, like America is flirting with self-destruction. Do they care or know how this is being viewed overseas? And do you think this terrible thing of the first ever debt default, not raising the debt ceiling, is actually going to pass?
I don't know. I mean, I certainly hope that it doesn't. I mean, I think the dirty little secret about the world we're talking about, which is in Washington, the Washington world we're talking about, is a level of insularity which completely shelters people from what the real sentiments of Americans and also people around the world are coming to think about this. And what that tells you is that, look, I mean, there is no there's nothing as powerful as self-interest in Washington, and people here are doing very, very, very well. All the people who are arguing on TV and who are shouting at each other on the floor of the House and who are writing blog posts, they're all getting paid. I mean, these are not the tens of thousands of people who are being furloughed, who have nothing to do with the people in my book or that you see yelling at each other on TV. So it's part of the broader disconnect that I tried to bring to life.
So is there a glimmer of hope, or is this now, as everybody says, the new normal? I mean, is persistent dysfunction, even the plunging over the cliff of a debt default, you know, are these things that are now just simply going to keep happening?
Well, again, I mean, I think self-interest is ultimately the most powerful thing. And if, in fact, you know, they don't raise the debt ceiling and there's this collapse and this calamity that some people are predicting, and ultimately people lose a lot of money, I mean, the politicians will be punished in a much realer way. And I think that will ultimately be a trigger to maybe get something done. But right now, no. I mean, the urgency doesn't exist. And I certainly hope it's not the new normal, but there aren't a lot of indicators, you know, in the day-to-day or even in the month-to-month that would indicate that this is going to change anytime soon.
Mark Leibovich, thank you very much indeed. From the New York Times and author of
Thanks,
This
Christiane.
Town.